The most dangerous threat during a collapse isn't the stranger breaking down your door at midnight. It's the friendly face you've trusted for years who suddenly sees your preparedness as their solution and your kindness as weakness. Picture this scenario and really let it sink in. Because this could happen to any of us tomorrow morning when the power grid has been down for 3 weeks, the grocery stores are empty, and that same friendly Jim who used to help you move your couch is standing at your front door with 2 other guys you don't recognize, asking very pointed questions about your food storage and whether you really need all that water you've been hauling into your house. The betrayal cuts deeper than any stranger's threat ever could because this person knows your routines, knows your family's schedule, knows exactly where your spare key used to be hidden, and most importantly, knows you've been preparing for exactly this kind of situation while he spent his weekends watching football instead of stocking supplies. This isn't some far-fetched Hollywood scenario. This is one of the most likely and most painful threats you'll face during any real collapse situation. And today, I'm going to walk you through exactly how to spot the warning signs before things get dangerous, how to set boundaries without escalating conflict, and how to protect yourself and your family when someone you trusted becomes someone you fear. This is exactly the kind of real-world preparedness scenario that I cover in depth in my new book, Before It All Falls Apart, the Emergency Prep Manual for the Real World, which is available on Amazon, and the link is in the description below. If you want to learn how to navigate these treacherous social dynamics and get access to my free home defense checklist, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling me about your own neighborhood situation, because I read every single one, and your experiences help shape the content I create for this community. Understanding why good people turn bad during emergencies isn't about judging them or becoming cynical about human nature. It's about recognizing the psychological forces that transform ordinary neighbors into potential threats, so you can prepare accordingly and protect those you love from people who might have been perfectly trustworthy just weeks before. When basic survival needs aren't being met and fear starts to cloud judgment, even the most decent people can justify actions they never would have considered during normal times. This transformation happens faster and more dramatically than most people realize because desperation strips away the social conventions that normally keep our darker impulses in check. Your neighbor Jim might be a stand-up guy who coaches Little League and volunteers at the food bank, but when his kids haven't eaten a full meal in 5 days, and he knows you've got a pantry full of canned goods just 50 feet away, that knowledge becomes a constant temptation that grows stronger every time his stomach growls. The psychological concept here is called proximity bias, which means people are much more likely to target resources that are close and familiar rather than venturing into unknown territory. Your well-stocked home becomes an increasingly attractive target simply because it's right there and he knows exactly what you have and how to get to it. Resource envy plays a huge role in this transformation because your neighbor has probably watched you carrying supplies into your house over the past few years, maybe even made jokes about your prepper paranoia. But now that paranoia looks like wisdom and his lack of preparation feels like a mistake that's threatening his family's survival. The moment you tell him no when he asks for help, the entire dynamic of your relationship changes forever because he stops seeing you as a friend and starts seeing you as an obstacle standing between his family and their next meal. This shift can happen in a single conversation where you politely decline to share your emergency supplies. Your friendly neighbor becomes dangerous not because he's inherently evil, but because proximity plus desperation plus familiarity creates a perfect storm where someone who knows your defenses, your schedule, and your resources faces a daily temptation to take what they need from someone they've convinced themselves can afford to share. Learning to read the subtle signs that your neighbor's attitude toward you is shifting from friendly to predatory could literally save your life. And these warning signals almost always appear gradually rather than all at once, which means you need to pay attention to patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents that might seem harmless on their own. The first red flag often appears as excessive friendliness that feels forced or strategic, especially if this person wasn't particularly social with you before the emergency began. Suddenly they're showing up at your door with offers to help carry your water containers or asking detailed questions about your generator with a level of interest that feels more like intelligence gathering than casual conversation. Pay very close attention to how conversations about resources evolve over time because what starts as casual comments like, "Wow, you guys are really prepared," can gradually shift into more pointed observations like, "You're lucky you have so much food," and eventually escalate into barely veiled suggestions like, "Surely you have more than you need," or "It's not fair that some people have everything while others have nothing." The tone and body language during these conversations will tell you more than the actual words, because someone who's moving from friendly curiosity to potential threat will start standing closer to you during conversations, speaking with more urgency or intensity, making more direct eye contact, and showing signs of agitation or impatience when you don't immediately offer to help with their resource needs. Watch for what I call inventory probing, which means they start asking increasingly specific questions about your supplies, how long they might last, whether you're planning to stay in the area, who else lives in your house, and what your daily routines look like. This information gathering almost always precedes some kind of action plan, even if they're not fully conscious of developing that plan yet. One of the most dangerous warning signs is when your neighbor starts testing your boundaries in small ways, like stepping onto your property without permission, opening gates or doors that they've never touched before, handling your tools or equipment without asking, or making themselves comfortable in areas where they previously would have waited for an invitation. These boundary violations usually start small and escalate gradually because they're testing your response to see how much they can get away with before you push back. Another critical warning sign is when they start bringing other people into conversations about your resources, or involving additional family members in discussions about neighborhood sharing or mutual aid, because this usually means they're building consensus for some kind of group action, and they want backup when they make their eventual demand for your supplies. Managing the delicate balance between protecting your resources and avoiding unnecessary confrontation requires a strategic approach that acknowledges your neighbor's desperation while firmly establishing limits. The key to success here is setting those boundaries early and consistently before the situation escalates, to the point where any response feels like an aggressive rejection of their needs. The most effective strategy is what I call controlled generosity, which means offering small amounts of help on your terms rather than waiting for them to ask and then having to say no. When you initiate the giving, you maintain control over the amount, the timing, and the expectations around future assistance. For example, instead of waiting for Jim to ask if you have any extra food, you might proactively offer him a single can of soup or a small bag of rice while explaining that times are tough for everyone, and you're trying to help as many neighbors as possible with what little extra you have. The language you use during these interactions is absolutely critical, because you want to frame your situation as one of mutual scarcity, rather than you having plenty while he has nothing. Here are specific phrases that work better than others. Instead of saying, "I can't give you any of my food," which implies you have food but are choosing not to share, say, "I wish we had more to go around, but we're all trying to stretch what little we have as far as possible," which positions you both as victims of the same circumstances, rather than adversaries competing for resources. When they ask how much food you have stored, respond with, "We're rationing everything pretty carefully and hoping this doesn't last much longer." When they suggest you have more than you need, try, "I know it might look that way, but we're burning through supplies faster than we expected, and it's keeping us up at night wondering if we have enough." Physical boundaries become extremely important during emergencies because your property lines need to be clearly marked and consistently enforced through subtle environmental changes that make it obvious where your space begins and theirs ends, such as hanging rope or caution tape along fence lines, placing traffic cones or other markers at the edges of your driveway, or even just sweeping and maintaining only the areas that belong to you while leaving shared spaces obviously untended. When you do have conversations with potentially hostile neighbors, try to keep them brief and conduct them at your property line rather than inviting them onto your land or going onto theirs, because neutral territory reduces the psychological pressure on both sides and makes it easier for either party to disengage if the conversation starts moving in an uncomfortable direction. Keep a mental record of every interaction with potentially problematic neighbors, including who said what, when the conversation happened, who else was present, and what specific requests or suggestions were made, because this information will help you identify patterns of escalation that might not be obvious in the moment. Building a network of mutual protection with like-minded neighbors can honestly be your most effective defense against hostile threats from other neighbors. But this process, requires careful evaluation of potential allies and strategic coordination that enhances everyone's security without creating vulnerabilities. The first step in building these alliances is quietly assessing other households in your immediate area to identify signs of preparedness, discipline, and the kind of mindset that suggests they'll be reliable partners rather than, additional liabilities during an emergency. Look for neighbors who maintain their property well, who seem to have their own emergency preparations in place, who demonstrate good judgment in their daily decisions, and most importantly, who seem capable of keeping information confidential rather than gossiping about everyone's business with other neighbors who might not be trustworthy. Signs of preparedness might include solar panels, backup generators, well-maintained vehicles, gardens, or food production, visible security measures like cameras or reinforced doors, and just general evidence that they think ahead and take responsibility for their own safety rather than expecting others to take care of them. The ideal alliance, in my experience, consists of 2 to 4 households that are close enough geographically to provide mutual support, but not so large that coordination becomes difficult, or security gets compromised by too many people having access to sensitive information about each other's capabilities and resources. When you approach potential allies, start with casual conversations about general security concerns rather than immediately proposing a formal arrangement, because you really want to gauge their interest level and their discretion before revealing too much about your own preparedness or intentions. While cell towers are still functioning, create a group text for sharing basic security updates, but establish code words for sensitive information like grocery run for supply delivery or family visit for security patrol. Once infrastructure fails, use simple signal systems like porch light patterns or window signs to communicate basic status updates between allied households. The visibility factor of your alliance can serve as a powerful deterrent to would-be threats, because when hostile neighbors see that you're not isolated and that any action against one household would provoke response from multiple households, the risk-reward calculation changes dramatically in your favor. This kind of strategic neighborhood intelligence and alliance building is something I cover extensively in my new book, Before It All Falls Apart, the emergency prep manual for the real world. Because understanding human dynamics and social psychology during emergencies is just as important as having the right gear or supplies. And you can find the link to that book on Amazon in the description below if you want to dive deeper into these concepts. One of the most effective ways to protect yourself from neighbor threats is making your property and your household appear to be a less attractive target than they initially assumed. And this deception strategy works because most people, even those in dire straits, will choose the path of least resistance when looking for resources to acquire through force or manipulation. The goal here isn't to make yourself invisible, which would be impossible anyway since your neighbors already know you live there and have some idea of your preparations, but rather to plant seeds of doubt about whether you're actually worth the risk and effort of targeting when there might be easier opportunities elsewhere. Visual misdirection can be extremely effective because people make quick judgments based on what they can see. If your house looks like it's already been hit by scavengers or like you're struggling just as much as everyone else, potential threats are much more likely to move on to what they perceive as better targets. Simple techniques like scattering some trash around your yard, hanging torn tarps or damaged items in visible locations, putting soot or dirt around your door frame to suggest forced entry, or leaving empty containers and packaging visible in your garbage can create the impression that you've either already been robbed or that you're running low on supplies, just like everyone else. The key to effective misdirection is making these changes look natural and authentic rather than obviously staged, which means using real wear and tear from your actual supplies, rather than creating fake damage that might look suspicious under closer examination. Controlled scarcity messaging means deliberately shaping the narrative about your situation through casual comments and observable behavior that suggests you're struggling with the same shortages and challenges as everyone else, even if your actual supply situation is much better than you're letting on. Comments like, "We're trying to stretch our canned goods as long as possible, but it's scary how fast we're going through them," or "Thank goodness we collected some rainwater yesterday because we're almost out," plant the idea that your resources are limited and diminishing rather than abundant and secure. Visual confusion strategies involve changing observable patterns in your daily routine and property appearance to make it difficult for potential threats to develop reliable intelligence about your capabilities, your schedule, or your defensive preparations. Rotate your lighting patterns so different rooms are lit at different times on different nights. Move vehicles around occasionally if you have multiple cars or access to others. Shift furniture near windows so the interior layout appears to change. And vary the times when you are visible outside doing maintenance or security checks. The goal is creating uncertainty in the minds of people who might be watching your house and planning some kind of action, because uncertainty breeds hesitation, and hesitation gives you time to detect threats and respond appropriately. While we all hope that boundary setting and psychological deterrence will be enough to avoid actual physical confrontations with hostile neighbors, the reality is that some people ignore all warnings and rational considerations once hunger or desperation takes over, which means you need concrete defensive preparations in place that can protect your loved ones if talking and misdirection strategies fail to keep threats at bay. Home hardening doesn't mean turning your house into an obvious fortress that advertises your defensive preparations to everyone in the neighborhood, but rather making subtle modifications that significantly increase the time and effort required for someone to force entry, while maintaining the external appearance of a normal residence. Start with your entry points, because doors and windows are where most forced entries begin, and focus on reinforcement techniques that aren't visible from the outside. Install 3-inch screws in door hinges and strike plates instead of the standard 3/4-inch screws that come from the factory. Add security film to windows that makes them much harder to break quietly. Place door jammers or security bars that can be quickly deployed from inside, and ensure that all entry points have multiple layers of protection rather than relying on a single lock or barrier. The concept of layered defense means creating multiple obstacles that slow down intruders and give you time to respond. Even if they get through your front door, they still have to deal with furniture barricades, interior doors with additional locks, and strategic placement of objects that force them to move slowly and make noise while navigating toward where you're positioned. Create safe rooms or retreat zones that have independent communication capabilities, emergency supplies, defensive tools, and most importantly, alternative exit routes that don't require going back through areas that might be controlled by intruders. Early warning systems don't have to be expensive or complex to be effective, and often the simplest approaches work best because they're less likely to malfunction when you need them most. Consider basic tripwire alarms using fishing line attached to cans filled with coins or small bolts, motion-activated lights or noisemakers positioned around your property perimeter, and simple door and window alarms from the hardware store that alert you immediately if someone attempts entry while you're sleeping or distracted. For children in the household, establish simple code words that mean "go to the safe room quietly" versus "we're practicing a drill," so they can distinguish between real emergencies and routine practice without creating unnecessary fear. Practice drills with everyone in the house, because during high-stress situations, people tend to freeze or make poor decisions unless they've rehearsed appropriate responses until they become automatic. Run through different scenarios, including nighttime intrusions, daytime approaches, single versus multiple intruders, and situations where different family members might be in different parts of the house when trouble begins. Establish clear verbal signals and hand signals for communicating during emergencies, because normal conversation might not be possible if you're trying to avoid detection or if there's too much noise and confusion for regular communication. Understanding the legal framework surrounding self-defense and protection of property is crucial, because even during breakdown scenarios, actions you take to defend yourself and your loved ones may eventually be subject to legal scrutiny if government authority is restored, and making decisions based on emotion or panic, rather than legal reality, could have serious long-term consequences. Castle doctrine and stand-your-ground laws vary significantly from state to state, and what's legal in Texas might be completely illegal in California. So you need to understand the specific laws in your jurisdiction regarding when you can use force to defend your home, what level of force is justified in different circumstances, and whether you have a duty to retreat before using deadly force even on your own property. The basic principle underlying most self-defense laws is that the force you use must be proportional to the threat you're facing, which means you can't shoot someone for stealing your lawnmower, but you may be legally justified in using deadly force if someone breaks into your house at night or threatens your loved ones with violence. Documentation becomes extremely important, because if you're ever required to justify your actions to law enforcement or in court, you'll need evidence that supports your version of events and demonstrates that your response was reasonable given the circumstances you were facing. Modern technology makes this documentation much easier than it used to be, So consider installing security cameras that record both video and audio if your state allows it, keeping a written log of incidents with dates and details, and saving any text messages, social media posts, or other communications that demonstrate threatening behavior or intent to harm you or those under your protection. The ethical considerations around defending yourself against former friends and neighbors can be even more challenging than the legal ones, because these are people you've shared meals with, people whose children played with your children, and people who under normal circumstances would never pose any threat to your safety or well-being. Setting your personal thresholds for different levels of response ahead of time helps ensure that your decisions during actual emergencies are based on rational planning rather than emotional reactions. Think through scenarios where you would give verbal warnings, where you would display weapons as deterrence, where you would use non-lethal force, and where you would be prepared to use lethal force. The moral question of whether to help neighbors who become desperate versus protecting your own household's resources doesn't have easy answers, but it's important to recognize that you can't save everyone, and attempting to do so might result in everyone, including those you're responsible for, facing starvation or worse outcomes. After any serious confrontation with hostile neighbors, whether it involved actual violence or just credible threats that required defensive action, your immediate priorities need to focus on ensuring continued safety, assessing and treating any injuries or damage, and repositioning for whatever might come next, because one confrontation often leads to escalation rather than resolution. The first priority is always accounting for all household members and ensuring that everyone is physically safe and accounted for, because during chaotic situations, it's easy to lose track of where people are or assume that everyone is okay without actually verifying their location and condition. You need to know immediately if anyone is injured, missing, or trapped somewhere that might still be dangerous. Secure your property perimeter as quickly as possible after any confrontation, because the people who just threatened you now have first-hand knowledge of your defensive capabilities and may return with different tactics, additional people, or different timing that addresses whatever advantages they observed you having during the first encounter. This means checking all entry points for damage, reinforcing any barriers that may have been compromised, and potentially repositioning defensive preparations based on what you learned about how attackers approached your property and what methods they used to try to gain access. The psychological impact of confronting former friends and neighbors in threatening situations can be severe and long-lasting, especially for household members who weren't mentally prepared for the possibility that people they trusted might become dangerous. Plan time for emotional processing and discussions about what happened, why it was necessary, and what it means for your ongoing security situation. Debriefing the tactical aspects of the confrontation helps you identify weaknesses in your defensive preparations, mistakes in judgment or execution, and improvements that need to be made before the next potential threat, because there's almost always a next time when you're dealing with people who view your resources as solutions to their survival problems. Review every aspect of how the situation developed, what warning signs you might have missed, what defensive measures worked effectively, what didn't work as planned, and what additional preparations might have changed the outcome. Communication with your alliance partners becomes extremely important after any confrontation, because they need to know what happened, what threats they might also face, and how the security situation in your immediate area has changed. But this information sharing needs to be done carefully to avoid creating panic or encouraging hasty decisions that might make everyone less safe. The hard truth about neighborhood threats during breakdown scenarios is that some of your most dangerous enemies will be people who were your friends just weeks or months before, and preparing for this reality isn't about becoming cynical or paranoid. It's about developing the psychological resilience and strategic mindset necessary to protect those you're responsible for from one of the most likely and most painful threats you'll face when normal social structures break down and desperation starts driving people's decisions. Everything we've covered today, from recognizing early warning signs to setting boundaries, from building alliances to tactical preparation, represents a comprehensive approach to neighborhood security that balances defensive readiness with the hope that most confrontations can be avoided through better communication and strategic deterrence. Remember that most of these confrontations can be avoided entirely if you recognize the warning signs early enough and take appropriate action to deter threats before they develop into actual dangerous situations. But you also need to be mentally and tactically prepared for the times when deterrence fails, and you're forced to defend against people who once shared holiday dinners at your kitchen table. The emotional toll of these situations can't be understated because defending yourself against former friends and neighbors creates psychological wounds that can last long after the emergency passes. But your primary obligation is always to those depending on you for protection, not to preserving relationships with people whose desperation has made them willing to threaten or harm you and your loved ones. If you want to dive deeper into these concepts and learn about the full spectrum of real-world preparedness challenges, I strongly encourage you to check out my new book, Before It All Falls Apart, The Emergency Prep Manual for the Real World, which is available on Amazon, and the link is in the description below because it covers all of these psychological and strategic elements of emergency preparation that can make the difference between survival and catastrophe when everything around you starts falling apart. Start implementing these strategies today by conducting honest assessments of your current neighborhood relationships, identifying potential threats and potential allies, and having serious conversations with your household about how you'll handle different scenarios if normal social rules break down and ordinary people start making extraordinary demands on your resources and your safety. If this video has helped you think through these difficult scenarios, and you want access to the comprehensive home defense checklist that covers all the tactical preparations we discussed today, make sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss content that could save your life, and drop a comment telling me about your own neighborhood situation, because your experiences and questions help me create content that addresses the real challenges that preppers face in their actual communities. Remember that knowledge and preparation are your best weapons against any threat. But they're only effective if you're willing to acknowledge uncomfortable realities and make difficult decisions when the safety of those you love is on the line. And I'll be here every week with more practical strategies and real-world insights to help you protect the people you care about most, no matter what challenges come your way.